session is going to be called Science, because Tejah says that's doing a lot of hard work here, Science, and Society. And we are really, really thrilled about this session because science is a very curious space and scientists are a very curious community. So scientists might be working on esoteric things. They might also be working on things that are very, very relevant to us. And scientists have access to knowledge and networks that oftentimes are just invisible to other people. So when they have this kind of access, what kind of roles do they have to play for society? And how should society even think of science and scientists is what we are going to be deliberating around today. And Tejah Balantrapu, who leads Science Communication at LV Prasad Eye Institute and is also the director of Hyderabad LitFest 2026, is going to be moderating this session. And he will lead the conversation with Suvrat Raju, who is a string theorist. Where is Suvrat? From the International Center for Theoretical Physics Sciences. Theoretical Sciences in Bangalore, and Satyanarayana Bheesette, who works with TIFR Hyderabad here. Tejah, all over to you.
Thanks for that, Somdata. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in. This is our first day, and I'm so glad that I can see all these people coming in, and these conversations are all kicking in. I must also thank Suvrat and Satya for their time for joining us in this conversation. It is an interesting set of questions that we have been discussing on WhatsApp, on phone calls, but this fundamental idea that Somdata sort of sets up in the beginning, which is there is a scientist, and what is their role in society, right? There is their function as a scientist, of course, but is that all there is? And if you see a scientist joining a conversation, be it a political conversation or a social conversation, what is it that they bring to that conversation? And also the opposite, right? How should society, all of us, at least I am not a scientist, I'm trained in the humanities. So how does society manage that conversation, and how do you support science, right? It is that tension that I'm trying to sort of explore today. Maybe perhaps we can begin with defining what is a scientist in this context, right? What is a scientist? What do they bring to the table in terms of their intellectual tools? Suvrat, do you want to begin, and then perhaps we can move on to Satya?
So thank you very much, first of all, Tejah, for having me, and thank you all for coming here. I think, the question that you're asking is really obviously a very important question. There are several ways, if one were to think about this, of the kind of way in which scientists can interact with society. One of them is, of course, that the kind of work they do might itself have a social impact, right? Then there is the fact that, if you speak of scientists, that science is slightly different from technology. It might be that science, in the end, it is technology that often impacts society. And it might be that science is ahead of where technology is. And therefore, one of the important things, and that's, I think, something that you do and Somdata does and others do, is that it's important for scientists to communicate science to society. So there is the entire aspect of outreach. The kind of topic I feel, I would like to discuss a little bit, which is slightly different from this, is what also scientists can do that is outside of their direct area of expertise. And the reason I want to discuss this is not because it's the only way in which scientists can impact society, but because it's an important and often underappreciated aspect of what scientists can do. So one of the ways in which scientists have contributed to society in India is through what are called the people science movements, that have not often been directly related to their speciality, but have been focused on more basic issues, such as the notion of a scientific temper, which as we know, India is very unique in having a clause in the constitution that says that we need to, all of us, it enjoins all of us to develop a scientific temper. And so one of the ways in which scientists can and have contributed to society is in terms of advancing this notion of a scientific temper. And to some extent, there are others in the audience who know much more about this than I do. This is also something that scientists have done. There is one more aspect though which I feel we should discuss, and this is an aspect in which I feel scientists in India have been sorely lacking, and that is the issue of what role scientists have to play when there is a contentious issue that arises in society in which we don't have a consensus, and in which on the one hand there might be, powerful corporate or interests or state interests, and on the other hand there might be the interests of ordinary people. And this is also a place where I feel scientists really can contribute. And there are many such issues that society faces, such as debates on nuclear energy, such as debates on intellectual property rights, such as debates on what artificial intelligence policy should be. Even scientists who are not directly working on these fields still have the tools and also the leisure and the ability to be able to analyze some of these questions and participate. And that I feel is something that they really should do that perhaps we have not done as much. And I hope we can bring some of that out in the conversation.
If I may, right, just to dwell on that last point a little bit, and then we can pass on to Satya, which is it, what in your, what is it, what are those tools? What sort of questions that does a scientific process allow a scientist that they can bring? We were talking about things like, say, some scientific honesty or some, I'll leave it to you.
I think, scientists, of course, we are very specialized in what we do, but we also have a tool bag of just basic tools and the ability to analyze data, the ability to understand and process data. And sometimes just very simple aspects of processing that data, whether it is, say, nuclear energy and what might the costs of some reactor be, or reading a law and understanding what the clauses might be. Or, a few years ago, all of us went through a pandemic. And there was a lot of data that was coming out there about the government's policy and what it was leading to, how much mortality there was. And just scientists having the basic tools and abilities to being able to process that data is already a skill that, is very valuable in society. We don't have a lot of people who are able to do that. And therefore, it behooves scientists to, take advantage of that and participate in this public interest, not just in terms of supporting, as unfortunately I have to say many people in the scientific establishment have done, in terms of supporting corporate or state interests. So that's, I think, the thing that scientists bring to the table.
We will come to that for sure. Satya, what do you think? What would be the value that science and scientists would bring to this kind of a conversation, especially a fraught conversation where there are divergent opinions, where people are not quite sure what is correct, and there is a lot of fog, as they say. What do you think scientists bring to that conversation? What sort of values, perhaps?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Do you want?
Oh, okay. Thank you once again. I don't think... Or is it now? It's not. Other way around. Yeah, so thanks once again for having me here. I want to take a little, maybe a back foot. I won't kind of use word to begin with a scientist, because somehow, without we knowing, when we say scientist, we tend to get that associated with science. Okay, maybe a better word for it is research and researcher. The point why I want to bring this in this context is that, if a scientist is for science, what about a person who does very deep kind of exploration in arts or in commerce or in language or for that matter dance or whatever it is, right? So anyone who can do a very methodological research, methodological study, and with a sole idea to kind of find something new, something which didn't exist. Of course, for science, it is easy to define because we say we want to, let us say, understand how nature works, right? We want to do a study with a sole goal to kind of see why maybe something is happening the way it is happening and so on. But I also want to kind of bring in close, because there was also a discussion about, let us say, science versus the other fields, in which many times it is just a kind of one going into the other, sometimes very naturally. Sometimes maybe it will take 100 years for a science to become technology. Maybe it will become 1 year sometimes, depending on what you do. So therefore, the technology is something where people pick up those scientific principles, those research outputs into kind of doing something which is obviously going to do good for the society. This is where society comes very close to what you achieve as a basic formulas, equations, scientific principles, nature publications, and so on and so forth. Of course, engineering is also something I look at very close to these two fields, because without optimizing the resources, whether it is, let us say, power of a cell phone, whether it is a size or, whatever the dimensions are, or weight or cost or whatever it is. So in my opinion, this whole spectrum of something you create knowledge, okay, starting from research, getting into maybe technology, getting into engineering, and coming into the hands of a person, in some way they are all related to a large extent. Therefore, when you say that what would be the role per se of researcher or scientist is, because the person inherently kind of comes with a reasoning capacity, whether one is purely talking about science, or talking about an incident, talking about an event, talking about a policy, etc., one is assuming, the general public assumes that, okay, he's a learner person, he's a person who can decipher A into B is something else, rather than giving, I would say, a solution which is not very logical. So therefore, inherently scientists, researchers are looked up for getting, let us say, certain logic or certain opinion about what is happening out there on the street. So it need not be confined only to find new theories and publishing and so on and so forth, but also able to give suggestions to public at large, government at large, and able to steer something which is good for the society. So scientists are, that way, have a much larger role to play rather than what is to be done guiding students inside the lab.
No, I think that's a good frame to sort of begin with, and perhaps you can even problematize it a little bit, Suvrat. And this is something that we were also discussing, which is this idea that it is not a simple research frame ultimately, right? It is operating in a framework. There's a funding model within which they must operate, right? And I think there is a culture of hierarchy. For example, there is a deferential system in place, and scientists are also part of that social and cultural network. And I think, Suvrat, do you want to talk a little bit about why? I mean, I don't want to, maybe why is the wrong question to ask, right? But you sort of, there is this frame where there is the research question, and it's messy rollout in society, where your funding and a whole bunch of other, even cultural factors perhaps, make it much more complicated. And ultimately, the scientist may believe something, or I don't know, I wouldn't want to make those guesses. But there is a model where a scientist has to sort of defer, right, to a dominant model perhaps. And I don't know how you think about, how would you sort of look at that, and why do you think that is a problem, or for us especially in the country?
Can I interpret the question slightly broadly, just to come back to what also you were saying, which was that, you often have a role in society that goes beyond just the technological implication of what you're producing in the lab. And you're right that there are hierarchical issues, but after all, one of the principles of science is that we are supposed to challenge authority. That's the basis of the scientific method, whether you look at debates that go back all the way to, Indian traditions of saying that, we are Nastics, so we don't accept the authority of what was said in, and, so that's very important. Now, the question is, do scientists really put this into practice? So there is one issue of subtle pressures that come from the funding model and so on, as you're saying. There's a more direct issue of pressures that come from vested interests. Just to take a concrete example that we were discussing at lunch, and to go back to the issue of the pandemic. At the time of the pandemic, there was this issue of having to process data and trying to come up with data-based recommendations for policy. Now, as it happens, a very prominent set of establishment scientists was commissioned by the government to produce, these data-based models. And the model that they produced, said in their paper, in their scientific paper, they said, look, we can mathematically show that the decisions taken by the Indian government have been optimal. I'm paraphrasing, but not much actually. It's, I don't remember. And that was, of course, what the government wanted to hear. but later it led to very bad policy because these scientists who extolled the policies of the Indian government and extolled the lockdown, later also said that, look, we have crossed the worst of the pandemic before the second wave. So, this is an example of where they were deferring to much more direct interests. And this is clearly a violation of the scientific method. I think it's very hard to look at the data objectively and come to the conclusions that they did. And the question is whether in our community we have been putting this into practice or not. And it seems to me the answer is no, because the scientists who did this didn't face any consequences. So that's something I think we should, discuss. That's a slightly different from perhaps the question you asked, but that might be more in line with what we were saying. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And I think there is also this question, right? There is also that messy middle where, where the choices are harder, right? Where it is hard for people to understand, right? Which way to, which sort of a decision to make. And that is where I'm assuming where scientists can potentially help, right? There is also, I think, there is also this question of purity, right? And I'm primarily thinking about material science and the sort of thing that you were focusing on, Satya. But in also this there is this ultimate pursuit of this excellence, I would say, that is it is there in all endeavors, but it is something that is very tightly, associated with a scientific enterprise, right? And there are also other questions of it, right? So I'm trying to perhaps come back to your core story in that sense, which is that, in 1965, there was this discovery in India of atmospheric neutrinos, and, and there is this idea of how do you sort of chase this ephemeral particle, right? And for that, you needed, this really, really, really pure sensors, really very sensitive sensors to pick that signal out potentially. It is something that we are still chasing, right? And this kind of a pursuit is not just limited to a specific country, or it is not a question of wealth, right? It is a question of, it's a human pursuit. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you are, right? And perhaps do you want to tell us a little bit about, perhaps because there are people like me in the audience who wouldn't know what a neutrino is, perhaps would you want to set the stage for what it is, and then perhaps, Suvrat, we could come back and see about the value of pursuing this kind of a project and separating it out from where, where it is far more messier, I would say. Please.
Yeah, so I think we are now coming into the main track, but I just want to add one more to what Suvrat said, which of course I completely agree. Now, I said before that the society looks up to these, the scientists or researchers to kind of able to give a logical sort of explanation or the direction towards certain things on the society, not necessarily solving problems of what they are good at. But having said that, one problem often comes to play, that is where many times the outcome of a scientific thinking doesn't result in real use to the society out there, is because science itself, a part of the science is a bit debatable, is a bit growing, it's a bit depends on how you interpret the data and so on and so forth. So therefore, it's not like saying, okay, I have this data, there is a very unique way, only way to reach this particular conclusion, so government should go ahead and do this particular thing. This is my output, this is my suggestion, this is how the world will going to move. It's not like that, because in some cases, of course, you do actual measurements. You actually, for example, physics is essentially an experimental science where nobody believes you unless you actually measure in the lab. Now, then you have tendency to say, oh, you are measuring it. Okay, that means that must be true. Well, measurement is a word that you generally use, but measurement can have many connotations. It can have errors, it can have biases, and so on. And therefore, the conclusion that you make could also inherently has errors. And so therefore, it may not be the solution for a given problem, especially outside science, the way I said. So therefore, one must keep in mind, and now I only said about measurements. There is a lot of science which doesn't actually work on measurements, more on a theoretical side, right? So these are more like models. These are more like what, a person can penetrate into kind of doing things, and there is nothing like measurements. There is nothing like an experiment. Now you can imagine, you can easily argue, you can easily fight with me saying that this is not something, this model doesn't work and so on. So please keep in mind when I said that people look up to scientists for solutions outside science stream, this is the peril that one has. Now let us come back to what Tejah asked me. Okay, he was referring to a particular piece of science that India should have been sort of doing it now and should have been at least one of the players on the top, not necessarily the only player. He was referring to, let us say, a particular experiment which is something to do with a neutrino. Neutrino is a very, very, very tiny particle. In fact, it is so tiny that it's almost impossible to detect. Okay. Now, naturally, you will ask, if you can't detect, how do you know it exists and so on? We can get into that little more scientific discussion later. But the point is that it is, let us say, 1 million times smaller than, let us say, an electron. Okay, electron itself is so tiny. Now you can imagine what I'm talking about in terms of how difficult it is to kind of detect. Anyway, let's not get into, but in 1965, Indian collaboration along with Japanese and UK collaboration has set up, now you can imagine 1965 what kind of instrumentation, what kind of technology, what kind of things existed. So it's a very, very rudimentary kind of building and detector. They detected what is called an atmospheric neutrino. Okay. As the name says, this neutrino is actually produced in the Earth atmosphere. Okay. By the way, neutrinos are the most abundant particles in around us. The only second to photons, right? You know photons. Photons is all here, right? It's a carrier of light. So this is the second most abundant particle. You have sun producing neutrinos, supernovae producing neutrinos, nuclear reactors producing neutrinos. In Big Bang, 14 billion years ago when the Big Bang happened, the neutrinos are produced and they're so, as I said, so difficult to sort of detect. There are still large number of those neutrinos which are produced 14 billion years ago around us. It's only they don't do any damage to you because they're very, very non-interacting particles. Now the point is...
Sorry, just to interrupt, just to get a sense of, what happened in 1965.
That's right.
That brought this kind of a
So the excitement that happened was in 1965, but something before happened. This is 1950s when Homi Bhabha, the founder of course you all know, TIFR and many other organizations, wanted to do a kind of physics that takes the advantage of having very deep underground mines in India. These are, Kolar goldfields, which is close to Bangalore city. There probably around 2.7, 2.8 kilometers deep gold mines existed. So what Homi Bhabha wanted to do, Homi Bhabha was known for, research on, muons, right? Okay, muons are again particles which are about 200 times heavier than electrons, okay? So his work mainly dealing with Bhabha scattering and so on is very well known. Now there are lots of applications for it. So what he wanted to do was do various kind of science experiments which require, such underground mines, right? So in 1965, people went to about 2.5 kilometers below to look for cosmic ray muons, but what they found in the process was something which was quite startling because they found there are particles which can reach all the way to 2.5 kilometers. And then they kind of realized that these are those tiny particles which are produced in the Earth's atmosphere. That has opened up a brand new field of atmospheric neutrino physics.
No, thank you. Suvrat, did you have anything?
I wanted to add something to this discussion, just bringing us back to the topic of the panel. Of course, one of the things that people, maybe many in the audience know about the Indian Neutrino Observatory was, it was a place where there was a conflict in some sense between what the scientists wanted to do and, what the distrust that people had. And in fact, the initial, you should correct me, of course, you're the expert. The initial site for the INO was denied environmental clearance at that time in the UPA 2 government by the Minister Jairam Ramesh. And the site was then moved. But even then, there was a lot of opposition to the INO, and as far as I understand, it's still in a stalled situation. Now, there's something I wanted to say which brings us back to the issue of science and society. Now, I was in a kind of a unusual position there because I felt this was an important experiment that, would have scientific value. I also happened to know many of the people's movements that in fact were opposing this project. And I found it was very difficult for me to persuade them that this INO project didn't have, in fact, just today morning when I was preparing for the session, I went and I looked back at some of the email discussions I had, and including the unhappiness that people had with me. It was very hard for me to even persuade them that something like neutrinos doesn't have military implications. It can't be used for defense, it can't. It can't be used as a new kind of weapon. There was no radioactive waste that was going to be produced. Now, the reason it was hard to persuade people about this, even though scientists were saying this, was because at that time there was also other debates that were happening, most prominently on the Kudankulam nuclear plant. And in that debate, the position that the scientific community took was very disingenuous. I agree with you that many times we don't have the right answers in science, but people expect that there should be a level of honesty and just scientific honesty and being forthright with people. And it's, the chairperson of the Atomic Energy Commission at that time came out and said, and you can just Google this, the chance of an accident is 1 in infinity. And this is a quote, you can see. And therefore, why are you worried about any environmental issue? There is nothing for you to be worried about. Now, when you say that in one case, which is clearly a false statement that people can see, and then you make a true statement in the other case, which is, look, the neutrinos can't be used for weapons, so people don't trust you because they say, look, here you were saying the chance of an accident was 1 in infinity. Now you say something, how do I know you're telling the truth? And that is something I feel we need to, wake up to. Not just that people are being irrational, but people see the fact that scientists sometimes are betraying their trust.
Unreliable, perhaps,
Exactly. And so then they don't trust you at other times.
So, and the question or the problem in a sense is that, so there are scientific or mega science projects which are worth pursuing, right? Which are difficult for us to execute, which are like these multinational collaborations, all of these terms can be used to other scientific endeavors also, which are far less straightforward in that sense, which are far more murkier, or at least, like the nuclear, I'm sure there will be people who will want to argue it, that it is, say, better than, say, fossil fuel energy, which is primarily the primary driver for all, right? But then, so it is a debatable one. Here, in a sense, as you say, it is a relatively straightforward choice. But because of this, of mixing all of this together, it becomes really hard to sustain that argument with the public, right? And could you share a little bit about what your own experiences were during the INO project, and perhaps what lessons do you think we can sort of take back? Some of it is communications, but I'm sure, but anything deeper than that, perhaps?
Yeah, I think, when you said my experience, I can't stop sharing this particular incident that happened very close to the INO site, a place called Karankudi, where I was talking to a set of people, largely students, but there were also the faculties and so on. And so after they heard my talk, there was an old gentleman sitting at the back, and he said, sir, I want to tell you something. I said, yeah, please, sir, go ahead. I want to hear from you. He said, see, one of the big problem why INO is being opposed by people locally is that the neutrino starts with a word called nu, which also, neutron also starts with the word called nu. I don't think most people here can make a distinction between a neutron and a neutrino. I think it made a big sense. Let me, in fact, incidentally tell you, when the neutrino was actually coined, it was not neutrino. Pauli actually called it neutron for some reason. Later on, Chadwick came back and actually discovered neutron. So then, he came back, and Fermi came back and named it as a neutrino. Anyway, that is a different story. This is just an incident I want to tell you. So, what Suvrat said is absolutely right. He was on the dot. In fact, when in one of the outreach talks, which was actually held right at the foothill of where the INO project should have come, I mean, people were so confident, quote unquote confident, that we are actually building this neutrino lab only to store the nuclear waste that is getting generated at the Kudankulam plant. Now, how do you tell them to say that this, I mean, if I store this nuclear waste there, I am the person who will die first, and we are supposed to be working. There was this graduate student who is from Teni. She came up and said, I am from your place, and I am going to work in the neutrino lab. And you think I'll work inside a neutrino lab where the nuclear waste is going to be dumped? Anyway, but unfortunately, in a time and space, both were a bit wrong, maybe. In that sense, one side Kudankulam coming up and the long story of all these were happening, and the other side, at the same time, this is happening. And somehow, see, I think I keep telling people as far as the INO project is concerned, these things happened in phases. The first phase was truly very clear social, clear misunderstanding about what we are talking about. Can you believe when I was talking to about, a kind of crowd started saying that, okay, neutrinos are produced in the sun and they actually come all the way down to the earth and so on without getting, stopped, etc. The impression that somebody got is as if it is a sharp knife object which can penetrate into human body because it can't be stopped. Now, this is the kind of, what I can say. I mean, I cannot say that, they are bad. It is maybe to some extent, that's why you mentioned about the language. I should be careful about using the language that people understand. By the way, language not only mean the words, but language also means you have to speak local language. Let us say Tamil. Okay, so it's very important. To some extent, I think this was, maybe we didn't do quite well. Maybe we should have been a little more careful the language that we use, so on. But what I want to quickly say is that if this was the origin of the problem, it was a little easier to solve because there was a genuine sort of misunderstanding about what we want to do. We want to keep saying that there are trillions of neutrinos all around since our birth and nothing has happened to us. Our body produces neutrinos. The bananas that you eat has, radioactive materials and so on and so forth. But all this, some way, is a more engaging the public. But what happened, the scenario, is that slowly the other characters entered the scene who are not genuine local people with misunderstanding about what neutrinos. Now, once that is there, it is like a person who is acting, sleeping, and you're trying to wake him up. And that has actually deviated the course of neutrino project to some extent.
If I may quickly jump in, and both of you please. So one is of course this question of communication and this good faith argument, as you can say. But from what do you think is lacking, or as a society, right? See, there is only so much you can do, right? You can't run a like a physics degree for every citizen that is going to come and stop you, right? So in terms of what is it that we think that as a society that we should be gearing up for, right? In terms of how do you see a complex problem, you are not equipped to handle or understand everything. You don't have the time or the ability to go back to first principles to figure out everything, right? You're not going to be a Fermi. So then how do you, and yet your decisions or your opinions matter, right? And you can kill or make that project succeed, right? How do you then think that societies should progress in these kind of complex, Suvrat, and then perhaps Satya?
Sure. I feel that just going back to this, and I completely understand, and I heard from many other colleagues also this issue of frustration, and you're asking now what society should do. In some sense, we could ask what the scientific community should do so that these issues become easier to communicate. And I feel we failed to live up to our responsibility, and we continue in some sense to fail to live up to our responsibility. The issue of nuclear energy, Kudankulam, that we were talking about, in fact, is back in the news. I don't know how many of you followed last month, for instance, the parliament passed a law that rewrites completely the framework that governs nuclear energy in India. And, this law, which is called the Shanti Act, and very briefly put, one of the main, apart from allowing private participation, the main clause in the law is what to do if there is a nuclear accident. And what the law basically does, and we can discuss the previous law and so on, is it first says if there is a nuclear accident, the multinational supplier that supplied a plant will be completely indemnified. And second, the company, the big company, which might be big private corporation in India now under the new law, will also have a cap on its liability, which is of the order of $400 million, which is 1,000 times smaller than the kind of damage that a nuclear accident can cause. So now there is a very problematic law that's been passed by the parliament, and what has the scientific community said about it? And the answer is nothing. Right? If anything, the scientific community might go out and say, well, you shouldn't be afraid. So if you look at the Department of Atomic Energy, they might say there's an unreasoned fear of radiation. But the criticism of this law and this framework is not coming because there is an unreasoned fear of radiation. There is a genuine criticism of the fact that this law is creating a moral hazard. And saying that, so what I want to say is that it's important for the scientific community to speak up in these times. It's a complex issue and we can discuss many aspects, but speak up with basic honesty and scientific integrity on these issues. If we were to do that, I feel that many other times when there are genuine issues, we would have a much easier time in communicating with people. If we, on the other hand, just stay silent because, look, there are very big, powerful corporate interests. We all know who those are. And, there's a state which wants to do something. And, we are not willing to take a stance against that. Then it comes back to hit us, I feel, at some point.
Just to sort of take that one step deeper, right? So even if this kind of a thing, right, where you have, there is some indemnity waiver and there is, so there is a logic to it, right? You may agree or disagree with the logic, right? So maybe one of the things that as scientists you can help society, I'm trying to elucidate on that example and I'm terrible at this, please step in. So, is like, how do you sort of, what do you look at actuarial tables to figure, I'm making things up now. So, you look at actuarial tables to figure out how, how do you understand, you say something like there's 1,000 times, there's a risk reward, difference of like 1,000 times, right? So how do you help people, right? So now I have to listen to, say, Suvrat, right? Versus, say, Tejah, who's saying, no, actually Suvrat doesn't know what he's talking about. See, now, that is the problem. That's the crux of the problem, right? And so the tools here primarily are, so what do you do, in a sense? See, I don't want you to give you, I'm not saying do X, Y, Z, right? So you understand what I'm getting at.
But this is, I think, a good example of a place where once you cut through the clutter, what you're, I just, not you, but there is a lot of clutter around these kinds of discussions where people say, look, there is nuclear energy and, it has less carbon emissions and so on. But once you cut through the clutter of this law, it's very simple. The logic is there are corporate interests that don't want to go bankrupt if there is an accident, right? And there are other companies who want to sell a reactor and don't want to pay anything if there's an accident, and they have enough influence that they can get laws passed to their benefit. There is no other logic, because let's say we disagree on the probability of an accident, and indeed the industry says the chance of an accident is once in 10 million reactor years. Great, then go ahead and accept liability, right? Accept 10 times the liability, because there's no chance of an accident. So why don't you just go ahead and accept liability for whatever for something that won't happen? I mean, if you tell me accept liability for the fact that, God will strike this thing with a bolt of lightning, I'll accept liability because I know it won't happen. So what I'm saying is the responsibility of the scientific
community. Just to step in there, there is a probability of a bolt of lightning.
I'll still accept liability. I think it's low enough that I'll accept liability. Yeah? What I want to say is that the responsibility of the scientific community is to cut through the clutter. Once you do that, then I think the issue is very simple. There is, of course, a logic. The logic is that there are some people who benefit from the law. Not that there is some impartial logic.
No, I know we are kind of coming to the end of the conversation. Yeah. Yes, please, Satya.
Okay, I mean, just continuing with what Suvrat said, I do agree, of course, there are, every technology, let us call now, every technology brings certain problems in it in terms of safety, in terms of maybe loss of life, whatever, right? But see, one has to be a little more holistic in that sense. Let us say an aircraft crashed a few months ago, right? And what is the typical, the kind of money that, let us say, the aircraft company wants to shell out? Something like 20,000 crores? 20,000 crores, somebody read it yesterday or day before? 15,000 crores? Now, I mean, why only do you talk about, nuclear reactors? Why you don't, a farmer can walk on walk in his fields in the night can be bitten by a snake and die. I mean, sorry, don't take it a literal meaning of it. But I want to say that risk in some sense is involved in every aspect, especially the larger the technology you are making use of, there are also more possibilities of something going wrong. And when something going wrong, the kind of replication that it happens can be much larger when you are walking on a street, when you are biking, or when you are going in a flight, or when there is a nuclear reactor, and so on and so forth. So I think they all have certain way, if you can look at, instead of only focusing on particular aspect, every technology, everything that making our life much comfortable is also can lead to problems involved. But I fully agree with what he said, in the sense there has to be a proper kind of a method by which what is safety, how much maximum you can take care of it, what are the liabilities of the guy who from where you purchase, who is operating it, the government which has kind of allowed it, etc. These are required. But I think we sometimes tend to kind of point too much because of a couple of accidents that happened in nuclear field. So we tend to kind of go towards and give more stress. This is my opinion.
So, and sorry, both of you, we come
Just one
winding up.
No, no,
Okay, I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
I think one difference between a nuclear accident and aircraft accident is an aircraft accident causes in the end limited localized damage to the people who are there and people in the aircraft. And a nuclear accident can cause much larger levels of damage.
Agreed.
Now the issue is, I agree with you that there is a risk in everything we do. The question is, who bears the risk? So the people living near the nuclear plant don't have an option, right? So it's completely fair to say the company that was running the plant should go bankrupt, because if we are risking our lives, they should also risk that.
Absolutely.
But the company makes a law saying we will not suffer loss, and the multinational company, which is even more powerful, says we are not even responsible if it is. And it's that law that is unfair. When the company refuses to take the risk, why should victims take the risk? So, that's
agree.
the thing that scientists should point out, because they can understand and analyze the data and see that this is the case.
All right. Now, thank you both of you. Let us open it up for questions from the audience, and then
Hey, hi. So generally the scientists operate in an ecosystem where your funding come either from the private institutions or from the government institutions, right? The feedback loops for private and government institutions are so small, like the 5 years or the quarterly, right? So there are cases where some discoveries won't have any usage, like the decades to come, right? There are two parts to it. One, how do you secure funding without getting pressurized from the private institutions and from the public institutions? The other thing, in chase of these profits, are we not taking the long-term research which might give productiveness in the longer run? And while coming to your thing, right, the aircraft is very localized and it is not a multi-dimensional problem. But the nuclear thing is like multi-dimensional, and the question is, if when you toss something, if it is heads, I'll gain. If it is tail, the loss is yours. That's what he just mentioned. Like,
The funding does come from the government. In the end, it's public funding, though. So we are accountable, just to make a small distinction, we are accountable to people, not to the government of the day, which might not necessarily be understood by the government, but I think it's an important point to make. Yeah, I agree with you, but in the end, society as a whole needs to set aside some level of resources to pursue fundamental research. That requires some social consensus and some demonstration of the value that fundamental research has to society in the long run. I think it's true that it does have some value. Clearly, much of the technology that we see around us eventually derives from fundamental research. The basic electronics that we see all come from basic fundamental physics research. The AI research, the AI technology boom we are seeing today came from research that was done over many years. So it's clear, but you're right, there needs to be a consensus that needs to be built in society. I'm not sure how successful we have been. Perhaps in India, we are not being very successful at building that consensus.
Satya, did you have anything? No, you're fine.
Actually, at the second point, I didn't quite understand what you meant.
No, I think that money is just a statement. Somebody's asking. Yeah.
Question? Yeah. So there are actually two questions, short ones. One is that coming to the question of language, yeah, you're right. My experience in biological sciences has told me that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible so far, for us to describe evolution in Hindi. Okay? Evolution is an idea that's been around for over 150 years, but we can talk about it in English and not in Hindi. This is one thing I found. It's nothing to do with language of the people and so on. The other is the point about scientists for their personal career advancement tend to overhype their discoveries. Okay, and and it's not considered good form for other scientists to say that I doubt this is true until that scientist is either dead or retired. So it is a catch-22. There's going to be a lag phase, yeah, between the overhype that goes. This actually, I did a little experiment, asked ChatGPT for progress in science that looked very promising 5 years ago, but hasn't paid out. ChatGPT doesn't have to be polite. It gave an answer which sounded pretty reasonable. So
Change happens with every funeral. You know? Sorry, there's a lady behind there. And
wanted to quickly point out one fact about the project that you were talking about. I think the main objection was about it being some tiger reserve and the animals had some crucial corridor there. So that, again, that objection is also scientific, okay, science versus science. And if the people were actually making such ignorant objections, confusing neutrinos with nuclear waste and all that, shouldn't we as scientists be alarmed and ashamed how little we have educated our masses? Because maintaining the body of knowledge, contributing to it, writing physical review D articles is not the only goal. You know, you have to curate the body of knowledge, which has become very huge intrinsic load. And we are not able to convey it to not even to the students, forget about the masses. Now even for the students, it's got bypassed, okay? So it's like all about entrance exams, MCQs. And so if you just take turn of the century physics, for example, 20th century physics, if you look at the load, the cognitive load of it, how many phenomena had to be observed, codified, and how those one conclusion led to another conclusion, just to understand how Rutherford did his experiments and how much of work went into it, how much you have to understand. When is our population ever going to catch up with it? And that is still, it comes onto undergraduate level of physics. So we cannot underestimate the amount of knowledge which is stuffed into every level. And we have to seriously work upon communicating it and maintaining it. And in the rush for publishing papers, for doing interdisciplinary works, the sound grasp of fundamental disciplines, physics, chemistry, biology, is getting lost. And that's a huge disadvantage to the society as such.
I think there's one more question here. Do you want to address?
Can I?
Yes, please. One question here, and did you want one? Yes.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, because she touched upon quite a few things, I hope I'll be able to give short answers. The experiment was proposed in the year 2000. Okay, I will not narrate to you the entire chronology. And we went through each of these, the approvals one by one, 2006, 8, 10, 11, etc., etc. The objection about Tiger Corridor came up in 2019. So that is 20 years after the project was kind of approved. Let us say 15 years after the project was approved by the government. Almost same time after the land was given to us, gratis, free of cost by the Tamil Nadu government. Now, I mean, I don't understand why suddenly the Tiger Corridor appeared in 2019, while we have been going through all sort of state, central, Ministry of Environment, Forest Clearance, National Board of Wildlife, all this when they were going on, NGT and so on and so forth. We promptly filed our complete answer on the previous web page of state government web page in 2019, within a few days after this particular thing has been brought up. There was no answer, there was nothing came about after that. So this is fact. You can go to Tamil Nadu Wildlife Board web page and see this particular application. You can go to any public information, you will see this. This is about the Tiger Corridor. Now, you are talking about, the fact that the responsibility of, let us say, teaching or making people aware of various things, it's very difficult for scientists to go down to school and teach them, right? I mean, you agree. I mean, the whole system has to evolve, that I fully agree with you. But that doesn't prevent a class 12, class 10, class 9 students to put up YouTube videos about the neutrino experiment, basically, as expected, not knowing anything about it, but saying that this project is terrible, this project is going to, reduce the cow milk, reduce the, grass is going to dry up, etc. Now, see, there is a dangerous thing. While you are talking about things which we should take as a responsibility, but we have our kids who also go on, because YouTube, primarily, there is nothing moderating about it, right? So you can put up, and that is much more spicy than somebody talking about what is good about it. So there are lots of things in between, to cover. It is very difficult for, as you said,
complex.
Complex
It's a very
kind
complex
of
case.
problem. It's not that simple as it seems, like what you talked about Tiger Corridor.
Yeah. Satya, sorry, we are now slowly running out of time. Is there any question at all, or if it's not there? Yeah.
Don't want to take much time. One thing is, we are assuming that I know I'm worried about speaking amidst scientists, but fundamentally we are assuming that is fundamental science actually leads to the progress. You take a look at any of these Asian tigers, including Japan, etc., that's not how they started. Borrow the science, apply it, and become rich, and then invest in science. In a sense that in a country like India, would you want to basically do the research in neutrinos, or figure out how exactly to basically do the basic foundational thing, basic investment to the other things, become rich, and then all these things are rich man's toys, like quantum physics, quantum science. I say, why? Let them develop it. Why do you want to develop a fundamental model? Don't. It's not worth your money. First, figure out to apply it and become rich, and then you can play with your toys.
If I may quickly,
That's the thing.
Devesh Kapoor and Arvind Subramaniam has this new book called the Sixth of the of Humanity, or the Fifth, Sixth of Humanity, and they call us a precautious democracy, primarily because we've done so many things ahead of what you think would have been the quote unquote right time. So yeah, I know this is like I don't know if you want to address it, or I don't know if this is the time we have the time to address this.
I only have
very quick thing.
Answer to him. You said once you become rich or something.
I think there was always some level of investment in the level of investment in fundamental research in India is very small in terms of a country. So it's not something that's taking away from many, many other benefits. If you look at, there's a lot that can be done while keeping, the level of, so I think it's given that we are such a large country, we are 1/6 of humanity, I think it would really be an injustice if we were to say that there are basic questions about the world that we can't explore. And I think they clearly do lead to progress in the long run, but I think if we were just to deprive 1/6 of humanity of, the ability for those who wanted to explore those questions, I feel that would be very unfair. Of course, we can have a longer discussion about this. I think we are running out of time, but I would, not.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
And I would agree, Suvrat. It is a question of, of human inquiry, and should there be any boundaries to it. And on that note, thank you so much, all of you, and thank you so much for your time and for your, scintillating conversations. Thank you.